Well, I just like to respond in kind of just random sampling to, or respond to a random sampling of some of the discussion going on this week about the singularity. Just a few remarks here and there. Gustav wrote something that I found very interesting. Sorry, that's my cat making weird noises. He's old. Um, Gustav wrote, "I got chills listening to Dr. Bostrom's talk. It was inspiring, but in the same way frightening. Inspiring because artificial intelligence can help us humans in many ways. Frightening because it might be the single largest existential threat to us ever. To be honest," Gustav continues, "I don't even know how we can solve the issue of the superintelligence turning against us. In my view, we just have to hope that it doesn't do us harm." Maybe that, at the end of the day, I mean, I've had that thought myself. Dr. Bostrom talked about programming it in a way so that it shares our values. That's a big point that Bostrom makes. But Gustav asked this great question. Okay, but what are our values? You know, the scarecrows around the R. If that will eventually become a very politically loaded question, or that will become likely to become a politically loaded question in the future, that's just such a great point. And it's a point that I think was brought up in week two, where we talked about autonomous vehicles. The Moral Machine Survey. I mean, what are our values? I mean, it was brought up for me because the values are necessarily reflected in the most common choices that are made in the Moral Machine Survey don't necessarily mean that I agree with them. And any attempt to say, well, these are our values in our current political and cultural climate, it's a very questionable move. Whose values? The values of the majority, or the values of a politically or culturally dominant group, or these are the kind of political questions, frankly, in the age of identity politics that we're asking all the time. So the notion that we can come to some kind of stable consensus about what our values are is questionable at best. I think it's an excellent point. Okay, let's program with our values, and then we may talk for the next 100 years about what our values are. I mean, I guess, and how do we decide? It's a great question. And then Gustav ended by saying, also, if the AI is truly super intelligent, why can't it figure out that it is in reality just serving us humans? I mean, I think it's bound to figure that out if it's really intelligent. Um, but that last remark really brought up a question for me, which is a distinct moral question and having to do with the personhood of true artificial intelligence. I mean, if something is truly a person, even if it's not a human person, then we would have to grant that it existing for us is morally problematic because it would violate the second version of Kant's categorical imperative, clearly. If it's a person, it's rational. And if it's a rational creature, then it cannot be used simply as a means, but has to be acknowledged as being an end in itself, which I interpret as meaning having value and having rights. So while it's not morally problematic to enslave your toaster, basically what I'm saying is it is definitely morally problematic to enslave an AI in the sense of viewing it as an object, which is just to be used and not to be respected. So I, that's a huge question. And again, Kubrick, 2001: Space Odyssey, HAL 9000. Watch the film. I'd like to comment on just one of the things that Andrew says in Andrew's post, the first paragraph. I find it interesting, Andrew said, how in discussion of the singularity, we tend to focus on how the emergence of a self-improving intelligence, self-improving superintelligence stands to affect humanity as a whole. with little regard to how particular social groups, et cetera, are affected. That's an excellent point. It shows how much larger of an issue this is, since in order to put it into perspective, we have to aggregate the entirety of humanity into a single group. Well, that's a great point. I mean, as a philosophy guy, I guess I'm maybe a little bit too comfortable in talking about humankind or the human species or us in this highly abstract way. Maybe that's kind of a dodge, on my part and philosophers' part. How will a superintelligence affect humanity? Well, humanity is composed of smaller groups, right? So when we ask about how will it affect humanity, we really mean, I suppose, the overall effect that it will have over many, many countless subgroups of humanity, not just nations or particular cultures, but people within nations and ultimately individuals, I suppose. So it's going to affect different people differently, I guess, is really what Andrew is pointing out, which is an excellent point. Andrew continues, however, as a side note, I'm concerned with how we will address the problem of deciding who gets access to technologies like mind uploading, AI assistance, neurological immunoenhancements when they emerge. Once they're available, is possession of any of them going to be considered a human right? That's, again, it's a closely related point to Andrew's first point. I see how it's distinct, and it's really a question of fairness. I think that Bostrom and Chalmers and everybody I've read who takes seriously the prospect of the singularity insists that there has to be equity in the way that the supposed benefits of the singularity will be distributed. That is the only ethical position, is that we must make all of the, whatever the benefits are. If there's going to be a singularity, that means that life is going to change for everyone, but it doesn't mean that the benefits will be necessarily be equitably, and I say equitably rather than equally, but equitably distributed, but they should be. Everybody says that. But it's just a really good question to raise, because we might say that about all of technology's benefits, the technologies that we have now, and they're not equitably distributed. Take something like healthcare. We know that your financial status, probably your race and ethnicity, probably your gender status affects the way that healthcare is delivered to you. In this country, at least, and probably in a lot of other places, but especially in this country. I was listening to a podcast about just how terrible things were in New York City with COVID this last spring, and that the survival rates for people in private hospitals as opposed to public hospitals was really wide. That if you had a really serious case of COVID and you had good insurance and ended up in a private hospital, you had much better chances at survival than if you were somebody on uninsured or on Medicare or Medicaid and ended up in a public hospital. Because the degree of care you're going to get is better, because essentially the number of patients that each health professional had to deal with, which is much, much higher in the public hospitals. So we are used to, especially we Americans amongst us, some of us are not Americans, but I can tell you that we Americans are used to the unequal and probably unfair distribution of the goods of technology already. So perhaps an American, I'm not saying others wouldn't too, but an American like myself would be especially skeptical about the fairness with which something as crazy and I'm sure initially as expensive and difficult as mind uploading, if that's even going to ever really be a real thing. The thing about technology, or technological commodities at least, like personal computers and cell phones, modern smartphones, cell phones, electronics in general, is that they start out being prohibitively expensive and then become more and more cheaply, widely available. I remember a friend bought a the first generation Mac back in the 80s, what do you call it? SE30 maybe. But I remember he had to take out a loan, it cost him $2,500, and that was in 1989 money, which was crazy. And the price of computers, obviously, just think of what a great computer you could get for $2,500, or back then that was worth like 5 or 6 grand. Just think of them, you could buy 6 great computers, basically. I mean, so the price of things does go down. Some things, at least, high tech things, eventually. But it doesn't mean that that's fair, that it would ever be prohibited. So that's a great question, I think, that Andrew asks. There are a couple of great issues that he raises. I'd just like to end up by looking at something that Carson wrote. Carson wrote, honestly can't say I share the same optimism as Bostrom, who clearly thinks humanity would reap immense benefit from superintelligence. I'm of the opinion that while this technology would certainly be advanced enough to solve problems for humanity, it's simply ridiculous to assert that it couldn't just easily cause new, unimaginable problems. Very Jonas. Very Jonas. I'm definitely not usually the kind of person to jump in and cite nature as a source for anything, but that feels so against nature that it just can't be a good thing. I'm not exactly sure. I mean, is it the creation of a super intelligence that would be against nature? But Carson continues and said, I'd be hard pressed to find somewhere where I think humanity is going too far with technology, but this might be the line. Well, that's a very reasonable objection. And I like the qualification there. Carson said, but they're not usually a person that said this, to say, this is unnatural. And neither am I would say too. I don't want to offend anybody, but I've taught the ethics of cloning before, and I have thought about it. And in principle, I don't think that we should ban human cloning. I mean, I don't see the rational part of the argument. I see the dangers of its abuse, but in principle, I'm not against human cloning if that ever becomes a thing. But that's another issue. So I'm not the kind of person who would say cite nature either, but I would share Carson's intuition that this might be different. The singularity is not just a creation of a superintelligence. It is the whole point of the singularity in the original formulation by John von Neumann, as I related by his friend Stanislaw Ulam, was that it was a point beyond which the recognized conditions of human life could not continue. Not meaning extinction, but meaning that things would be so fundamentally changed that this would be an utterly novel situation. And you might have heard the expression of post-human. I think that post-humanity, that is, that either biologically will change so much, which is basically what Chalmers is saying, or the cultural conditions and the material conditions of human life will change so much, so that after the singularity occurs, we will no longer be human in the strict sense. That is, we will have changed. So if that's the kind of thing that Carson is skeptical about, I think that's a good skepticism. And Jonas would definitely say that this might be the line over which, if you step, maybe it's just going too far.